Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review American Gods Season 3, Episode 10. So, in the end, I would probably say I don't know if I can quite recommend this episode to anybody. I don't quite understand whether or not that this show or this episode was good enough. I think that there is an interesting thing going on in a cryptic like sense going on with Shadow Moon in this episode, to where people could say, "Oh, well, I'm hooked. I want to see what happens. I want to see more. What is to go on with this character?" And so on and so forth. I have to mention that in a very cryptic like sense. Uh, if anything, it seems that there are characters in this episode that aren't really who they say they are, or it seems that a person that we assessed or assumed was this person all along could actually be someone else. Which ultimately, when thinking about it, some riddles or magical words ultimately make me believe that one person could honestly be a person that I'm very familiar with, and ultimately we'll get into that ultimately in spoilers is who I think this is, and I will get to that immediately in spoilers. So ultimately, if you don't want to get spoiled of who this person could quite possibly be, then ultimately go and watch the episode. If you do not have stars, go into a movie pro app, ultimately there in fact go and watch that there and come back here, because immediately I'm going to try to mention what is to go on with one character going on in this episode. Here is my thing. There was a lot of times here where I was just like, man, there is some acid trip going on within this episode. There's a lot of effects. There was a lot of bizarre things going on that I was like, God, they had wasted and ate up so much time in this episode with these bizarrish dream-like sequences that make no sense to me, even though they're not all dream-like things. They're just things to just kind of give some kind of bizarrish illusion or camera angle thing to eat up time, I believe. Here's the thing. I don't know if I could garner 100% of this episode being a viable thing. Like, I'm looking at it, I'm like, God, like, why did we stretch out this season if ultimately to not get to the point of every single episode? Because some people might just get restless and just be like, okay, well, like, if anything, I'm just gonna be watching one episode out of an entire season to see the beginning, early stages of the season, and then to see where it concludes. Because if anything, there was a lot of conclusions being drawn in the last episode, where this episode was just kind of like prepping people for what's to come mostly, or ultimately give us a little bit of knowledge of a character that we had never heard or seen before. Um, Technical Boy has some things going on with him in this episode that make for, if anything, a quite possibly interesting development with that character. So if you are interested in Technical Boy, and you're kind of interested to see where his journey is going, this episode is the thing for that. It really kind of tells you what is going on with Technical Boy, and I thought that was the most interesting thing going on in this episode, because there is not a lot of things that I either could understand about this episode, or there was stuff that otherwise was justifiably just like, what the heck is going on? What is going on with any of these things? There was anything like a time of pausing after watching this episode where I was just like, what? I was having to like brain like I was like I have to like I had to unpack all the stuff going on in this episode and take and process, and otherwise justifiably like go like, okay, maybe this there's some puzzle here, there's some uh figuring out. if there wasn't a lot of times where ultimately in episodes before you would have to understand who characters are, I think now in this episode it's just kind of like, okay, now we're here to try to process who Odin is in this thing. Is he a hero? Is he a villain? To some people, uh, what is actually going on with Shadow Moon in this episode? Uh, what is to ultimately go on with any number of these people? There's so many things that are ultimately to unpack within this episode, but there is also a lot of bizarre effects that are also going on in this episode where I'm just like, man, get the weed out, just whoo, just start puffing, because man, uh, this one is just a mind boggle at some point to just be like, why waste time with all these bizarre visuals that are just too Rubik's Cube not make sense. But other than that, I think it's about time to go into spoilers about this episode. Uh, I would say ultimately, I guess I would have to recommend this episode just because I feel like there are some interesting things going on into it, but it's not a 100% sold for me for this episode. It's not a 100% like I would go out, I would say people go out of your way to watch this episode, but I feel like there is some character development here that ultimately people will find fascinating by the tail end of this episode. So and some people will be like, hey, what's going on with my character that I like? What's going on with this person now? It feels like there's really, if you have invested in certain characters and you want to see where they go, this is the episode to do that. So let's go into that double five time territory and go into spoilers about this episode. There's a lot of weirdness going on, and hopefully people can, if who haven't seen the episode, may not understand what the heck I'm talking about, but I'm going to try to break this episode down as best as I possibly can because there's a lot of jumbled mess going on with this episode as well. So, we end up in the very beginning of this episode. We end up having it to where seemingly Bilquist is ultimately having her bizarrish dream sequence where she's ultimately talking to the old lady that she had danced with in the episode previous where she was involved in. And it seems like this old lady is going to, I guess, I would say that this uh, character is either death or looks like death somehow, um, because she ends up having seemingly quarters or some kind of currency upon her eyes, which ultimately is to mean that she is dead. She's already been dead or something along those lines. I don't know. I'm just seeing coins in the eyes to ultimately say that this person is dead already. And it ultimately seems that this old lady had a where she was dancing with Bilquist. There was some painting that was otherwise moving, and the old lady had looked at this painting that was moving as a very like Ego, the Carpathian Ghostbusters 2 kind of approach. Told me, say, hey, I'm not dead yet. Like, hold on. And so we end up and the reason why I'm saying this is the beginning of this episode, we end up having it to where Bilquist is talking to this old lady, and ultimately this guy is to appear in bizarrely some boxer-ish like getup to ultimately grab some bizarre staff that makes no sense to me. It seems that the old lady is struggling to get this freezer open, and we ultimately have it to where Bilquist is to attempt to try to get this freezer open. I don't know what any of this stuff means. It's effing bizarre. But this old lady is to basically tell Bilquist that she needs to help Shadow Moon find his soulmate, to find the right connection that ultimately Shadow Moon needs to, I guess, drive him to be what he, I guess, needs to be. I don't know. This is so bizarre because we end up having these bizarrish visuals going on where we have Shadow Moon in one half and we have like Laura on the other half of his like side, and just kind of like we're mixing up these visuals of ultimately trying to figure out the Rubik's cube of who Shadow Moon needs at his side bizarrely. So we ultimately have Bilquist ultimately to seemingly wake up from this bizarrish dream to otherwise tip over a candle full of wax. And this candle is to take this wax to ultimately make a design of the of North America. And so we end up having it to where it seems that Bilquist's medallion or necklace, ultimately with this big jewel on it, is to be kind of magnetized to this wax, outline of the United States. We end up having it to where Bilquist takes the necklace off to ultimately showcase exactly where she is supposed to go, and we end up having it to where this zooms in upon this one America hotel or motel. So we end up having it to where ultimately Shadow Moon and Ibarus are to ultimately go to this hotel to ultimately give Odin a visual of sorts, a visual. Ultimately, a funeral of sorts, because ultimately they need to bury him, of course. So we seemingly have it to where this one motel is seemingly a neutral, godless like place to where ultimately it seems that gods cannot attack one another in this place. It basically is a nullifier, I think, for everything. To where I guess if there's a treaty signed or whatever, because we end up having it to where reasonably Shadow Moon says to Ibarus, it's like, why is it that like when they did the peace treaty, why didn't they go here? Why didn't they take Odin and Mr. World and take them here? And speaking of Mr. World, we end up finding out that Mr. World is not all what he is saying that he is previously. It says that he is much more of a trickster, which immediately when I hear the word trickster, I'm like, so is Mr. World actually Loki? Is that what that is? Is that the reason why we heard about Odin, we've heard about Thor, but we've never heard one thing about Loki? Is it because actually Mr. World the entire time, because ultimately of all of his tricks, all of his bags, of all of his stuff that he's doing, is he actually Loki? I'm curious now. I don't know. We'll have to find out whether in these episodes further on whether Mr. World is Loki or not. But it would make a ton of sense realizing this now, that ultimately how many times has Mr. World been any number of different kind of people, because ultimately when looking at the Marvel movies where Loki has been Captain America and ultimately any number of people, basically the same thing now. Like, I guess they should have came up with that a lot quicker, but when looking at it, it took the word trickster told me go, huh, I guess he is Loki now. So, going back, so we end up having it to where everyone is to arrive at this motel. We end up having Mr. World ultimately seemingly talking to Laura, and we end up having it to ultimately Laura is to be baffled and confused, because ultimately the Mr. World that she is familiar with is very different than the Mr. World that they have in this episode. We end up finding out that Mr. World mentions that it's like, well, there's some times that I look in the mirror and I really would want to change. And so we end up having it to ultimately Mr. World is to lock Laura into her room to ultimately see what exactly they are going to do with her. And we end up having it to where Laura ends up going into the ventilations and ultimately climbing through there, to ultimately get to a much more secure place, because ultimately Laura can't trust anybody. She thinks there's something fishy going along with this, and her fishiness is otherwise justified. So we end up having it to where Laura ends up going and is the uh, underneath the table of which that Odin is laying on, and so we end up having it to where ultimately Chisernabog is ultimately going to Shadow Moon and saying like, "Hey man, like there needs to be some justification for this. There needs to be some justice for Odin dying." And so we end up having it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately saying, "Well, hey man, like I'm doing the best that I already can. Like I'm already doing a visual, whatever the word is. Uh, Shadow Moon is already putting this guy in the ground, and ultimately, like that is way more than what he should have honestly done. Because reasonably, when looking at it, like the guy barely knew that it was his father, anyways, and so on and so forth. So Chizernabog wants justice, and reasonably, like, because we have it to where Chizernabog is ultimately realizing that with Odin gone, that there is like a big shoe to fill. With Odin gone, like, are the old gods just going to die off? So that's Chizernabog's scrambling for trying to just say like, "Hey, Shadow Moon, are you going to take on the mantle? Like, come on. Like you're our leader now. You're kind of like you're our you were number one. You're basically Odin's number one guy. So you're going to be the new leader kind of now." And so we end up having it to ultimately uh, we are to start having people kind of collectively circle around Odin's table, because if anything, there is at some point where Mr. World is kind of concerned that of what Shadow Moon is going to do. So we end up having it to where seemingly uh, Shadow Moon is bizarrely having this seemingly weird like dream sequence where he is seeing Odin on a horse, ultimately pointing him to seemingly his ancestors that ultimately are looking to Shadow Moon to take on the mantle, to save them from uh, being lost forever, I guess. And so we end up having to where Shadow Moon goes and jumps on the horse with Odin to ride off. I'm assuming that is some metaphorical symbol for Shadow Moon ultimately going and saying like, "Hey, uh, I will save the people that believed in me. I will save the people that like I will jump on my horse and ride off to wherever I need to otherwise protect things, and to otherwise." There's a lot of metaphorical things going on with here, but anyways, so we end up having it to where bizarrely that weird dream sequence that made no effing sense to me, uh, just a weird off thing going on there. But then bizarrely, we are to see a siphoning in of smoke of sorts that was to otherwise be inside Shadow Moon's room. We are also seeing Chernabog ultimately going and giving it to the desk counter lady at this hotel, and we're ending up seeing them both like having a bedroom business scenario with bed sheets covering themselves so you don't see anything. Wow, they show like, man, they're just really effing with their audience and not in a fun way of just going like, hey, yeah, we're doing bedroom business matters, but when looking at it, we're also just not, we're like hinting at things, but we're not actually doing things. What the F is going on with this censorship? I just don't understand it. Like, what is the point of censoring this? I don't get it at this point. Is it a joke that they're trying to do? I don't get this. Because ultimately, when you have a bed sheet covered bedroom scene, what is the point of having that in the story? You can edit it out. You like it's a waste of time to just show the sounds of things bizarrely. Like why are they bizarrely like pulling back and trying to do these kinds of scenes? It makes no sense. But moving on. So like is it important to the writing of the story that they have these scenes in here? But they have to modify it to censor it more? I don't know. It's weird. So we end up having it ultimately round table discussion. Odin on the table. We end up having it ultimately. Shadow Moon is ultimately talking to Odin's former fiance, I guess we could say at this time, because he's dead. We end up having it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately talking about Laura and because ultimately fiance is ultimately mentioned. I don't even know her name. I should probably learn it because ultimately I'm just gonna keep saying Odin's fiance consistently. We end up having this character ultimately going to Shadow Moon and basically saying that like, hey, Laura killed Odin. Like, what are you gonna do? And like ultimately Shadow Moon is to basically mention how he's still mentioning that Laura is a ex wife to him, and ultimately we are still kind of unsure if Shadow Moon is 100% moving on from Laura, because ultimately if Shadow Moon has 100% moved on, ultimately Shadow Moon just like, dude, she's dead. Like she's gonna be dead right now. I'm gonna go and find it, and I'm gonna go grab her, kill her now, and be done with it. Shadow Moon isn't doing that. Shadow Moon is just kind of like I think he's kind of playing the fence, and that's where people are gonna start getting concerned about how much uh, towards the fence that Shadow Moon is playing, to where it's starting to ruffle everyone's feathers, to where ultimately it's like, dude, get this done right now. And Shadow Moon's just like, no. So, because we end up having it to ultimately, Shazernabog and Mr. World are to come into there, and ultimately, Mr. World is basically throwing Laura to the wolves. Basically telling them like, hey man, like this whole Odin's death thing has nothing to do with me, Mr. World. It has everything to do with Laura. So if you have a problem with Odin being dead right now, go to her. And here's the thing, we end up having it to where Mr. World had made a contract mentioning that Shadow Moon would not die, Laura would not die, and Selim would not die. But I guess ultimately, after all is said and done, Mr. World is just going to otherwise just take that contract and burn it up. Basically, just saying, like, well, I got what I wanted out of the deal, and now I can just throw Laura to the wolves because it would help my way of life. So we end up having a troll to Mr. World is like, yeah, I want no part of this. Like, ultimately, traditions will ultimately tell us that, hey, that Shadow Moon has to take up take revenge of Odin's death by killing whoever had killed him. And so Ibris is like, yeah, man, like we have traditions, and that's one of them. That ultimately, Shadow Moon, you have to go and kill Laura. It's the rules. It's tradition. So we end up having it to ultimately Mr. World and everyone is to go to Laura's room, and they realize that Laura's gone. But we end up having it to where Mr. World, with his goons, ends up going and collecting Laura anyways, and we end up having it to ultimately Shazernabog is ultimately saying like, well, hey, like this mortal was manipulated by Mr. God or Mr. World, and so reasonably, like, Mr. World is as much to blame as Laura is for Odin's death. And so we end up having to where Shazernabog tries to go and hammer his way into Mr. Lord, but there is, of course, a force field between the two characters because I guess this is a neutral zone where ultimately they can't attack one another. It's kind of like in the movie Dracula Untold, where we end up having it to where a vampire can't attack another vampire, I think, or something along those lines. I know there's some vampire movie where a vampire can't attack another vampire. It might either be in Dracula Untold, or it might be in Abraham Lincoln Abraham Lincoln versus or Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer. It might either be in one of those two movies. Um, I'm trying to remember which one it is, but it's a neutral zone. It's kind of like Highlander and being in churches and so on and so forth. It's a place where they cannot attack one another if they tried. So we end up having it to ultimately. This ends up just resolving with nobody being able to do anything. We end up having it to ultimately Shazernabog is ultimately telling Shadow Moon exactly where to go to be able to kill Laura, and ultimately gives him his hammer, and Shazernabog ultimately leaves. We end up having it to ultimately Laura is talking to Shadow Moon, and Laura won't leave this motel. And we have it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately going and saying like, well, like I'm not going to kill Laura. Like, I'm not going to do this. Even though it's the right thing to do, even though people want me to do it, I'm not going to lift a hammer or a finger or whatever to Laura. Because her actions, honestly, were justified. Like, if anything, hey, a death for a death kind of thing, and ultimately Laura has been dead 3 times now, and we end up having it to where I'm assuming or assessing at some point that Laura is going to go after Mr. World because of the null and void contract that basically Mr. World had basically burnt up after he got what he wanted. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately talking to Laura, and really we end up having it to where we have both of these arguments for both sides of these things, where Shadow Moon is talking to Laura, and Laura is kind of justifying a lot of things to Shadow Moon, to ultimately convince him. It's like, well, hey, my attempt was justified, and so we end up having it to where Shadow Moon is going like, you know what, I'm not going to lift a hammer. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to kill this person. I'm just going to move on and bury my father, and that's what I'm going to do. That's the most important thing to me right now, and I'll figure out all the rest of this stuff later. So we end up having it to ultimately Shadow Moon is to do this visual or whatever the freaking word is. So we end up having it to where they are to drive all the way out to this gigantic looking tree that I'm sure had to be CGI'd in. And like I would assess that this tree is probably like I would say it's a one of those trees where ultimately like I'm assessing what's gonna happen is that ultimately this is gonna be like the Luke Skywalker tree where we're gonna have it to where it's gonna be an entire episode within the next episode where Shadow Moon is gonna have to like fight his father and kill his father in like a Darth Vader kind of sense to otherwise a uh, become a person that comes to a realization or a person that comes to be and realize that uh, that they otherwise like the whole thing with Luke where Luke goes into the one uh, that one cave or whatever or tree or whatever and ends up finding his father and then he realizes the entire time that when he had fought and tried to kill his father and otherwise his father ended up uh, showcasing that Luke was just fighting himself. Like that scenario, I think, is what's going to happen, quite possibly with Shadow Moon, where ultimately Shadow Moon is going to have to fight his father at some point, and instead he's realizing that he's actually just fighting himself, and so on and so forth. Because we end up having it to ultimately, people are telling him that ultimately, if he does this ceremony, that he could quite possibly die by doing it. And we end up having it told to me Shadow Moon goes into this barn with these three women that are all kind of bathing him and rubbing him down seductively, of course, because why not? We end up having it to ultimately Shadow Moon is to put on put on this robe, and Shadow Moon is kind of like, should I really be doing this ceremony? Should I really be going at this? Should I really be doing this? I could die by doing it. What is the point? And so we ended up having it to ultimately the ladies are to ultimately say it's like, well, like are you sure? Do you want to do it? And ultimately he's like, yeah, I think it's the right thing. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon ends up going and being taken by this tree, and while taken by this tree, it seems that this tree is like wrapping its branches and stuff like that all around Shadow Moon. And the more and more that these branches are to seemingly almost consume Shadow Moon, we end up having to where all of a sudden, bizarrely, Shadow Moon is to ultimately talk to his father. And if we remember that ultimately the very first time that we had ever seen reasonably Shadow Moon with Mr. Wednesday, which was early on in season one, they ended up sharing a plane together. And so we end up having it to ultimately uh, we have Wednesday talking about cashews and how great they are because this is important. And we have it to ultimately Shadow Moon is ultimately going and getting his pre-flight meal, which ultimately is a like calzone or some kind of food of some sort. It ultimately has maggots and stuff in it, and so we are ending up finding out that supposedly Mr. Wednesday is talking to Shadow Moon and basically mentioning that Shadow Moon is to basically become a martyr for the old gods. His death, I think, will be a meaningful thing to push the old gods um, to one have people believe in Odin again, and ultimately to uh, recently I'm assessing to uh, be kind of called into the action or to regroup to otherwise say like, hey man, uh, like we had lost Shadow Moon, so like, hey, like we got to step up now. So we end up having it to where this entire time we are to realize that quite possibly Shadow Moon is going to die within this tree to ultimately rally the troops. So quite possibly we are never going to see Shadow Moon again in this show. It's quite possible that Shadow Moon is dead. But when also thinking of it, it seems like there was a storm brewing. There was some lightning that was all of a sudden popping off. And I was like, well, wait a minute. Is this going to be like the Robert Redford movie, The Natural, where we're going to think that Shadow Moon is definitely going to be dead, and in the very next episode, the tree is otherwise going to be hit by lightning because Shadow Moon ultimately, his power is something to do with weather. And so when looking at it, I'm assessing that this tree is going to be hit by lightning to free Shadow Moon to ultimately have him come back. So if people are ultimately assessing 100% that Shadow Moon is dead, I would say no. I would say no. I think there's a storm brewing. I saw lightning in the background, and immediately that's what popped in my head, that that is the next thing that's going to happen within the following episode. Here is also the thing. So we end up having Technical Boy, and we end up finding out that Technical Boy ultimately is trying to find some information. It seems that ultimately he's going through some archive files, so to speak, of Mr. World's headquarters, looking for some secret information, some hidden stuff. We end up having it to ultimately Technical Boys getting stopped by one of Mr. World's goons, and ultimately one of the goons is to showcase the head grabber, and we end up having it to ultimately Technical Boy turns the head grabber onto this goon, ultimately saying like, "Dude, I hacked my way out of that head grabber. Don't you think I'd be able to re-engineer it? To ultimately have it to where instead of it attacking me, it attacks other people? Come on." So we end up having it to where Technical Boy ends up finding this one mystical item of sorts. We end up finding out that ultimately Technical Boy has some kind of totem of some points, or something, like some kind of thing to tell us that ultimately Technical Boy has been around for a very long time. Technical Boy could be the most powerful god out of everyone because ultimately, when looking at it, uh, Technical Boy was an old god, and also Technical Boy is also a new god. So like Technical Boy kind of bridges the gap because ultimately technology consistently changes. To where ultimately we end up finding out that Technical Boy does not even realize that he is both a old and new god, and because ultimately so much time has passed, and every time technology tends to shift or change, we end up having it to ultimately uh, Technical Boy seems to have a shorter lifespan of memory compared to all the other old gods or new gods or whatever. And so ultimately, we end up having it where Technical Boy does not remember how long he's been alive for or been around for. And so ultimately, we end up having to where Mr. World is to tell Technical Boy of this fact that ultimately Technical Boy has been a old and or new god uh, within the changing of time. And we are ultimately to tell or have Mr. World tell Technical Boy, it's like, well, yeah, like, if anything, my power is to be able to manipulate and to be able to trick people. And we end up having it to ultimately Mr. World is to basically put up some kind of bizarre force field or some kind of fence like digital fencing like thing going on here to have Technical Boy not be able to leave this room and to have Mr. World walk off, ultimately having ultimately Technical Boy asking Mr. World who is he, which I'm again assessing is probably Loki at this point. I could be wrong. I'd like to be wrong. But when looking at it, it could be a much more interesting character that we may not be familiar with, which would be great. Uh, Here is also the last kind of leaving out thing. So we end up having it to ultimately Laura is ultimately at the hotel. It seems that ultimately she is waiting for probably Shadow Moon to come and collect her to ultimately, like, we end up having to where Laura, I think, is waiting to see what Shadow Moon is ultimately going to do with her. Whether he's going to kill her or not, or whatever. Like, I think Laura's just waiting at this hotel, just saying, like, hey, man, I'm going to stay in one place. Like, you can decide my fate if that's what you want to do. So, we end up having it to ultimately, Laura is to seemingly have this flashback of sorts where she is to be in this kind of 50s or 40s or whatever like dress, dancing with this bizarrish man. And then eventually we have it to where eventually Laura is to seemingly get out of this dream to open her door, and Bilquist is ultimately waiting for her, ultimately saying like I can't believe you're here. And so we are to assess that ultimately, bizarrely, Bilquist had kissed Laura in this dream sequence. And then Bilquist is to otherwise arrive to ultimately say, hey, like, thank God you're here. We ultimately end up having to where Laura had kissed Bilquist once before. So I'm like, is Bilquist going to end up with Laura? Like, is this going to be the next Laura Mad Sweeney connection? Because it seems that Laura has to be connected with some god somehow. And I'm assessing that it's going to be like, okay, well, Laura needs some kind of god to kind of protect her right now, and Bilquist has to be that person. So I think that is about all that I covered through most of this episode. Salim wasn't even an existing thing in this episode. We'll see what happens with him, because I'm assessing that they're probably going to bring him back in this episode to do something. We also have it to where ultimately there's been a while since we've gotten a real flashback episode, which I'm assuming that's probably going to happen sometime soon. I'm hoping we get a flashback thing of Mr. World, because I think that'll be the most beneficial thing to put into this show, or a flashback of Technical Boy, helping us understand exactly what is to go on with either Mr. World or Technical Boy. I think reasonably, if either one of these episodes are to go on, I think I will be happy about that. To otherwise help us understand these characters more, and especially Mr. World. I think if they do an entire flashback of Mr. World, I will be completely 100% pleased with that, because I think we need much more of a backstory or an unveiling who eventually this character is. I want to, because I ultimately do not think we are going to see what is to happen with Shadow Moon. I think that is going to be quite possibly, like, we are. I think what's going to happen is we're scared of what's going to happen now, and ultimately they're going to sit on it for the episode of next week. So I'm going to get out of here to make this review shorter. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.